It's commonplace to hear claims that we don't know who wrote the Gospels and that they were put together late by anonymous writers working from unreliable oral tradition. But the evidence disagrees with that. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show some of this evidence. We'll see that the Gospels were written in the lifetime of the apostles by people who had access to eyewitnesses. So subscribe to the channel, hit the notify bell, and off we go. So the first bit of evidence really comes from the obvious accuracy of the Gospels. There are various bits of evidence that support this idea that the Gospel was written so very accurately. For example, the Gospels contain accounts of people, of places, of events, and even descriptions of customs, which can be found in either archaeological digs or in literature written by people at the time. And the Gospels are always exactly accurate on that. Another one, the pattern of language that's used. Language changes from time to time and from place to place, and the language used in the Gospels exactly fits first century Palestine. It has a high amount of Aramaisms in it, or of Hebraisms in it, and it contains figures of speech which we find also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these aren't coincidences, these are trivial details which appear in the accounts in the Gospels. If you compare one with another, you can find that you get little pictures which are nothing at all to do with the main narrative that stand out and show how accurate the Gospels actually are. And one that's been discovered very recently, if you produce a statistical distribution that shows how many people are called by each different name, and then match that with what you find on things like funerary inscriptions or literature from the right time, then you find that they both have the same distributions. A test that wasn't available until the 19th century. It's something that the Gospel writers couldn't have done deliberately, and yet it's exactly accurate. The Gospels fit the period when they were written and which they describe. So there's one very important event which is going to dominate anything about the dates of the Gospels, and that's the war between the Roman Empire and the Jews. It started in 66 AD, it finished in 73 AD with mopping up operations, and the climax was in 70 AD when Jerusalem was stormed by the Romans. It was almost completely destroyed. It was sacked. The population were mostly killed, but the ones who survived were taken away and sold as slaves elsewhere in the Roman Empire. And a lot of the land of Judea and Galilee lost its population. They went elsewhere. When the place was resettled, which would be something like 60 years later or even more after that, then it was resettled by different people. It was resettled by Greek-speaking people with totally different customs. So there's a break, and the Gospels reflect the time before 70 AD. So let's look at the actual dates. There's a date chart. We've got the resurrection of Jesus, which probably took place in 30 AD, but it might have been in 33 AD. Those are the 2 years when Jesus could have been crucified on a Friday. That's the beginning of the period. The Gospels obviously weren't written before that. And the end period, we've got the Jewish war in 70 AD. It starts in 66 AD, and it's something which is not reflected very much in the Gospels. There are predictions of the destruction of the temple, but there's nothing that suggests they've been fulfilled by the time the Gospels were written. The other event which marks the start of the post-gospel period is the fire of Rome. So in 64 AD and in July, there's a great fire spread through Rome and destroyed a huge amount of the city. Probably more than half the houses were burned out. And the emperor at the time, a chap called Nero, decided to blame the Christians for that, and he started a persecution. And the persecution of Christians is something which is marked in the literature that Christians wrote. We've got literature written after that time, and it tends to reflect this idea of persecution. Not there in the Gospels. So we've got a picture of the lifetime of Paul. If you put together the Acts of the Apostles and the various different letters, you find that they fit together like pieces in a jigsaw, something that suggests also the accuracy of Acts and of the letters. And you can work out that in 57 AD, Paul arrived in Judea and was imprisoned, taken to Caesarea first of all, and then later on he was sent to Rome. He spent the winter on the island of Malta and arrived with the earliest possible sailings in 61 AD. So he arrived in Rome right at the beginning of 61 AD. 60 AD. Now, that allows us to put a date on the Acts of the Apostles, because the Acts of the Apostles ends by saying that Paul spent 2 full years in Rome, and it doesn't say anything happened then. Just abruptly comes to an end in the very early stages of 62 AD. And the only real way you can account for that was that was when the Acts of the Apostles was written. The Acts gives us all sorts of other bits of dating that we can fit in very nicely with the letters. So the first book in the New Testament to be written is probably Galatians, and it's written very early on in 48 AD. We can put Thessalonians in 50 and 51 AD, and very crucially 1 Corinthians 55 AD. And the accuracy with which these datings are known is that we can place 1 Corinthians in 55 AD between Passover and Pentecost. So in the late spring, maybe the very, very early summer. The other date that's interesting is 1 Timothy, which we can get by putting together a chronology from the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And that has 1 Timothy written in late 62 AD, just a few months after the Acts of the Apostles was completed. So let's look at the date for the Gospels then. First one, Luke's Gospel. Well, we know that Acts of the Apostles was finished in early 62 AD, and the first couple of verses of Acts refer to the Gospel of Luke. They're both written to this chap Theophilus, whoever he was. And here in Acts, the first verses describe the Gospel of Luke. It's a book, the first book, so it's written before Acts, and it deals with what Jesus did and taught until his ascension. Luke was written before the Acts of the Apostles. Acts of the Apostles is written in 62. So Luke's probably written 61 or earlier, because it'd take a couple of months to write Acts. So it must have been written before that, so 61 or earlier. Another passage, this one's in 1 Timothy, and it refers to scriptures. The first quotation is from the Old Testament, but the second one is interesting because it has to be a quotation from the Gospel of Luke. There's a similar quotation in Matthew, but it just ever so slightly different in Greek. And we can see this is a quotation from Luke's Gospel. So we also know that Luke is written before 1 Timothy, which we put in late 62 AD. So clearly Luke is written before 62 AD. Now, Luke gets his opportunity to find out what happened. He's writing an account which he gets from the horse's mouth, is what he writes at the beginning of Luke's Gospel. And that means he had to be in Judea to do it. He turns up with Paul when Paul is imprisoned in 57. He's then left there for a couple of years while Paul's in prison. He can go and collect information, and he can write that in his Gospel. So the Gospel of Luke is probably written after Paul is imprisoned. So that puts it between 57 and 61 AD, probably towards the end of that, after they have arrived in Rome, because Theophilus is probably a chap who lives in Rome, maybe the person who sponsored the copying of Luke's Gospel and of the Acts of the Apostles. But we have a 2-year period probably, and Luke is written sometime in that period, but it might have been a bit earlier in 57 AD, or just a bit after. Matthew's Gospel. Well, Matthew's is a lot harder to place. Matthew's very, very good at writing in a sort of way from outside. He writes in a method which doesn't give much away about how he wrote it. So we do find, though, one passage that's of interest. This is to do with the death of Judas Iscariot, and it talks about the authorities in Jerusalem, and they bought a field which they used as a burial place for strangers, and they used the money that Judas had thrown back to them. And that field, it says, is called the Field of Blood up to this day. Now, in 70 AD, of course, Jerusalem was destroyed, the population was deported. No one would remember the name of a field after that. In fact, the field boundaries would have been destroyed by the Roman soldiers to use as firewood or to build siege weapons with. So the field boundaries would have gone. There would have been nothing to show which field was called the Field of Blood. But Matthew is quite confident it's still called that when he wrote his Gospel. So that puts Matthew's Gospel before 70 AD, as it doesn't refer to a war that's ongoing, probably before 66 AD. And if you say it's written after Mark, it must have been written after the late 50s AD. So somewhere in that period, we've got the Gospel of Matthew. What else we got? Well, John's Gospel. And again, there are passages which refer to Jerusalem still standing. Remember, we talked about archaeology finding places. One of those places is the Pool of Bethesda with its 5 colonnades. It was destroyed in 70 AD, but John says there is in Jerusalem. He says it's still standing. It's standing now in Jerusalem. So when John's Gospel was written, the Pool of Bethesda was still standing, and we're talking about a period there before 70 AD. So John's Gospel was written before 70 AD. We can set a limit on how early it was, because John appears to know how Peter died. Well, Peter would die in the persecution that followed the fire of Rome, probably fairly soon after it happened. So it took a couple of months to organize the persecution. But in the autumn of 64 AD, Peter would be being rounded up with other Christians and would be put to death. So by 65 AD, Peter would be dead, and John would be able to refer to that in his Gospel. That means that we've got this period from late 64 to 70 AD when John could have been written. Again, it doesn't refer to an ongoing war between Jews and the Romans, so it's probably written before 66. So that puts it in 65 or 66 AD. And the last Gospel is Mark's Gospel. Now, there are a few allusions to bits of Mark's Gospel which appear in 1 Corinthians. And those allusions suggest that the Corinthians knew Mark's Gospel and that Paul knew Mark's Gospel. He was in Ephesus at the time. So Mark appears to have been writing information he got from Peter, and we know that Mark wasn't with Peter until at least 50 AD. He went on a missionary journey with Paul. He went out to Cyprus with Barnabas, and it's not until 50 AD that he's available to be a companion of Peter and take Peter's notes and use them to write a gospel. So we've got this period between 50 and 55 AD where we can fit Mark in. All right, let's put those together. There we go. All the Gospels are finished before 70 AD, probably before 66 AD. Mark's Gospel is the earliest, somewhere between 50 and 55 AD. Now, the important thing there is that all those writings happen in the lifetime of the apostles. The apostles, all right, one or two of them got killed early on. James, the brother of John, was put to death even before Galatians was written, but most of the rest of them were alive. So we've got the apostles, we've got other eyewitnesses, all of them alive. And the other thing is that people note that Mark's gospel, Luke's gospel particularly, sound very friendly towards the Romans. Well, that's not too surprising because they're written before the Romans started persecuting. So that's a summary of when the Gospels were written. First of all, they're written well within living memory of the events. So people who had seen what was happening would come across the Gospels and they would be able to say, yeah, that was accurate, or no, it wasn't. People like Joseph of Arimathea, who owned a tomb, or Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus's cross, and named in the Gospels. People would talk to them and they would be able to say, yes, it's true, or no, it's not true. And they could give a comment on the accuracy of the Gospels. Not only that, but that includes the critics of Christianity, the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. They would be able to go over the Gospels and say, did that happen or didn't it happen? And no one produces a great argument on the inaccuracy of the Gospels in ancient times. The people who would know keep quiet. Basically, the Gospels are considered accurate by them. The other point, of course, is that the apostles were still alive when the Gospels were written. So John was still alive when the Gospel of John went out. Matthew was still alive when the Gospel of Matthew went out. Peter and Mark were still alive when the Gospel of Mark went out. And if someone had been writing a gospel in their name, which wasn't correct, which wasn't anything to do with them, then they would have objected, and we would have known about it because it would have appeared in the bit literature that appears just after the apostles finished writing the New Testament. Okay, so who wrote them? It's the other important question. So again, look at the times. We have various documents which tell us who wrote the Gospels. It's attested by later writers. There's an interesting one, the Muratorian fragment. It's not complete, unfortunately, but it consists of a list of the books in the New Testament. Sadly, we haven't got the first page. There seems to be a page missing from the middle. But we know that the second, well, we've got a little bit of a description of the second gospel, which might be Mark, might fit Mark. He then says the third gospel is Luke, and it tells us that the fourth gospel is the gospel of John. Each one has a little description which fits the gospels we know. Other writers, well, Tertullian, he was born somewhere around 160 AD. His writings are the bit marked by the red bar, and he writes about the Gospels and he mentions who wrote them, and he has the names that we have on them as well: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Irenaeus of Lyon, he also writes about the Gospels, and he's very keen to say there are four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gives some kind of account as to who wrote them. Earlier than that, Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp's interesting because he was alive when John was alive. In fact, the two overlapped. As a young man, he actually met the Apostle John, at least according to Irenaeus of Lyon. And it's a bit more difficult to date his writing, but he quotes phenomenally from the New Testament, and especially from the Gospel of John, and he mentions the names of the apostles with them. And then the earliest one we've got is a chap called Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, and again he overlaps with the apostles in his lifetime. As a young man, he may have met some of them, and he writes that Matthew wrote Matthew's gospel, that Mark wrote Mark's gospel, and he says that Mark wrote from the accounts given by Peter after Peter had been teaching. So all the early writers agree who wrote those Gospels. They're the people whose names we have on the Gospels. Now, again, critics have a tendency to say, but the title of the Gospels varies from one manuscript to another. That's being a bit naughty, because yeah, okay, it does vary slightly, but not by anything you would notice. So here we are. This is one of the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. It's Papyrus P66, it's known as, and you can see there's the title of John. It says the Gospel Evangelion Cata according to, and then there's the name of John. It's more readable if you use ultraviolet light. And you can see there the person who produced that manuscript wrote the name of John on it. There's another one. This is P75. These two are both written just before or around the year 200 AD. And here we are again, the Gospel according to John, and the names are written at the tops of the Gospels. Variation. Well, some of them say Gospel according to John, like this one does. Some of them say according to John, miss the word gospel out. And one or two very late ones say the Holy Gospel according to John. But all of them say John. Everybody says this gospel is written by John. The variation is, do you call it a gospel or a holy gospel? Or do you just say, well, this is John? So there's no difference in the writing. The only difference is exactly how you refer to the book, not who wrote it. Every manuscript agrees. There are no dissenting manuscripts. They all agree in the traditional authorship. But, well, let's look what we know about the gospel writers. Matthew is one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, but he isn't called with the first ones. He's called later on. He is an eyewitness of some events, but not all of them, and he has to rely on what he found out from other apostles, possibly from Peter, for some of what he writes. Mark, well, he was the son of the person who owned the upper room. That's the place where the Last Supper took place. And he would have met the apostles. They would have been in his house at the time of the Last Supper. He was in Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion, and he later on was a companion of Peter, and he got the information from Peter. So we've got an eyewitness giving him information. Luke was a companion of the Apostle Paul on some of the Apostle Paul's travels. He spent 2 years in Judea while Paul was in prison there, so he has plenty of time to talk to eyewitnesses. And in fact, you can track where he went by the way that he refers to places. You can see that he spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, but that he also did a journey up through Samaria into Galilee and then back down through Perea. May have gone the other way around, but you can see he visited those places and found out what he was talking about. And finally, the Gospel of John. John was part of the family firm that fished, but they had employees. It was a biggish firm, and he seems to have been the person who traded the fish, and it was pickled, took it down to Jerusalem as a delicacy and sold it there. And of course, he was an eyewitness to many of the events that happened in the Gospel. Sort of little detail that confirms that. The phrase "the house" refers to a specific house, and it's different houses in different Gospels, interestingly. So in Mark's Gospel, when you get the words "the house," that refers to the house that Peter lives in, to Peter's house in Capernaum. But in Matthew's Gospel, the phrase "the house" is a reference to Matthew's house. So look at that, how that works out in the Gospels. This is the account of the parable of the sower. So in Matthew's Gospel, we've got them starting off in the house, and they sit down. They leave the house, they go walk down to the seaside, they sit down, the crowd gathers, Jesus starts teaching, it gets too big, so he gets into a boat, and he sits in the boat, and the crowd's on the beach, and Jesus is teaching them from the boat, and then he starts to tell them the parable of the sower. And that's Matthew's account of it. In Mark's account, we've got a Peter's eye view. Peter doesn't start off in Matthew's house. Peter meets Jesus down by the seashore. And he says a large crowd gathered, he got into a boat, and it's the same incident. But the difference, very tiny differences between the two, the differences are enough for you to say, that's Matthew's eye view, that's Peter's eye view. When you get to Luke, who definitely wasn't there, doesn't say anything about the house, doesn't even say anything about the boat. He just tells them there's a big crowd and Jesus taught the parable of the sower. You can see the difference between three different viewpoints there. It's characteristic of what happens in the Gospels. We can start to track down the sources used and the people who are writing down what they found out in the Gospels. So Matthew and Mark report details that would be available to eyewitnesses. They were writing from an eyewitness point of view. Luke isn't. But all of what they're writing is immediate eyewitness testimony. It's something that the gospel writers have either seen themselves or have got from someone that they saw the same thing. Luke is the companion of Paul. You've got a picture of him traveling. What's interesting is how you know he's a companion of Paul. Well, passages like this one, he talks about the travels and he says, we traveled, we made a voyage, we remained in the city, we went outside the gates, we sat down, we suppose there was a place of prayer. He's there with Paul. He's including himself in the authorship of Acts. And if we go on a little bit further, it's not all the time. Part of the time Luke wasn't with the Apostle Paul, but when Paul comes into Jerusalem, Luke is with him. We're still talking about we came to Jerusalem, the brothers received us. And the interesting one is that here he is introduced to James. James is the brother of Jesus. He's the most important apostle in Jerusalem at the time. And James can talk to Luke, maybe not on this occasion, but later on. Luke stays in Jerusalem, and Luke knows people who are eyewitnesses to what happened in the gospel. So he's in a position to get his information from the horse's mouth, which is what he says at the beginning of the gospel. John, well, we can deduce various things about the writer of John's gospel. First thing is, we can say he's Jewish. He has a very comprehensive knowledge of how Judaism was practiced in the first century. He knows about what he taught. He knows about the attitudes Jewish people had. He knows about the practices they followed. And he refers to the Jews in a way which is part of the Jewish community. He talks about the word coming to its own people. He doesn't really approve of the Jerusalem authorities. But nonetheless, you can see that he knows all about Judaism. He himself is a Jew. Second point, he's not just a Jew, he's a Jew from Judea or Galilee, or maybe both. He knows the geography of the area extremely well. He can tell you about the pool of Siloam and about the pool of Bethesda and about the Kidron Valley. He can tell you how deep Jacob's well is. He knows the area extremely well. So that puts him in Galilee. And when you read the gospel, you find a whole lot of patterns that appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's clearly writing with a language pattern that comes from that area at that time. Well, he then gives all sorts of little tiny details in his writing which tell you that he knew where things happened. He had little irrelevant details about those places. He knows about the circumstances which were happening at the time that whatever incident he's writing about took place. So he's giving the position of an eyewitness. Oh. Not only that, the details he gives shows that he knows the actions and thoughts of the disciples, and he reports the mistakes that the disciples made. So he's a disciple of Jesus. And if you look at the references to disciples, all the Gospels, the three big disciples, the three disciples that appear a lot are Peter and James and John. But James and John aren't mentioned in the Gospel of John. Now, it's very unlikely that John didn't know about this apostle, so why doesn't he write about him? Well, there are two possible reasons. One is he didn't know about him, which is unbelievable. The other one is that he is John, or maybe James, except that James was killed very early on. The gospel would have to be written very, very early if it was written by James. So it's probably written by John. And this sort of concentric proof shows who wrote John's gospel. Right. People often say, well, the gospels couldn't have been written by eyewitnesses. They're wrong. There are tremendous claims to have been written by eyewitnesses. So here's one from the Gospel of John. John is standing by the side of the cross and he sees Jesus is dead, and they stick in a spear into his side, and out comes blood and water, bloody fluid and a clear fluid that looks like water. And he then goes on, he who saw it's borne witness, his testimony is true, he knows he's telling the truth, that you also may believe. It's definitely a claim to be an eyewitness. And you have little details that are eyewitness details. So this is Jesus in Samaria, and he sits down. It says he sat thus by the well, Jacob's well, and he sat down like this. That's there in the Greek, not in every English translation, but it's there in the Greek. And that shows how John did his gospel. He didn't sit there with a pen and write it, because if he had, no one would ever write. He sat down like this, you know your reader can't see you. But if you're dictating it, you're talking to someone else, you're telling them the story, and you sit there and you say, he sat down like this by the well. And the person who's writing that writes it down. Maybe he translates it into Greek or improves the Greek, gets it just right. John checks it. That's how the gospel's written. Includes these details, and John is there writing down and checking, is responsible for that gospel, but somebody else may have held the pen while it was gone and written down. But the details there are very much consistent with this being eyewitness testimony. When you read it, you're reading what someone saw. There are a whole ton of these little tiny details there in John's gospel. Last point about eyewitnesses. This is from the first letter of John, and that probably went round with the Gospel of John. The two went round at the same time, and it's a sort of explanation as to the background to the Gospel for us, and for them, it's for the people who first read it, it's telling them why John wrote that Gospel. But you look at the claims, that which we've heard, that which we've seen with our eyes, that which we've looked on and touched with our hands. We've seen it, he says. That which we've seen and we heard, we proclaim also to you. It's no good saying that no one claims to be an eyewitness. They definitely did claim to be eyewitnesses, and here is just a part of that claim. So there you go. You've got Gospels. They're written by eyewitnesses, or they're written by people who have access to eyewitnesses. Sometimes an eyewitness writing from information he's got from a different eyewitness, because he wasn't at that particular instant at that particular time, an eyewitness to other parts. But you've got people writing during the period of the apostles, and you've got people who are eyewitnesses to the Gospels. So there's a lot more evidence. Barely touched the subject, the surface of this here. Let us know what you think about this evidence. Put it in the comments. Of course, subscribe and see other videos coming up on the same kind of subject. Don't forget, we're talking about one of the most important books in the world. It's up to you to have a look at it and see for yourself.